account we're using does. Like 3, 2, 1, go! It almost feels like you're playing Mario Kart. It's kind of funny. So here we are, Sunday, the first Sunday after the third and fourth Dualistic Unity retreat. There has been a lot of change all around in the community, in my life, in Andrew's life. There have been ripples, of course, that came from the retreat, but also just from the work that we've all been doing in our individual lives. And so I have no idea what the fuck we're going to talk about today, but I have no doubt it's going to be interesting, probably a little insightful, and more than likely a little emotional. We're going to try and toss some humor in there, is what I'm saying. It's going to be a hell of a day. How you doing, Andrew?
I'm doing pretty well. Yeah, it's funny. We might as well just get right back into it. The that example you used the other day of the Mario Brothers sort of thing, going through all the stuff, all the whole game, beating the game, and then going back to the start has definitely resonated a lot with me. I feel like I'm just aware of so much more, and I'm seeing so much more of the behavior that I've had over the last, I don't know, year and a half, in it from a totally different point of view. Like there were just things that I would do that I just wasn't aware of. Like you almost block them out. You don't even realize where certain things come from, like certain ways of acting. And now I'm just seeing that all of the ways that I've acted in the past, like I have so much more, I'm like hyper aware of everything in a way. So it's like almost like a foot in each world of like seeing that I could get caught in conceptual bullshit and ideas, or I could, like, the thoughts are there, but I'm recognizing every single day, like, thoughts are bullshit. They're never the truth. Whereas, I don't know, over the last 6 months or so, when I'm always going up and down through the emotional spectrum, but there, I didn't need that reminder that thoughts aren't truth as much because there weren't as many thoughts coming up necessarily, or at least it didn't seem like that. Whereas now it's like they're all always right there, and I have to be way more not attentive to them, but just constantly remembering that they're bullshit. Like I'll go through a few minutes of just getting lost in something in my head, and I'll try and figure my way out of it. And then it'll just hit me like, oh yeah, thoughts are all bullshit. They're all fucked. And then I just stop. And then I go back to just paying attention. And I'll go through this whole fucking journey, this entire path of like getting lost in something. Like something will come up, be like, oh, that could be the case. Oh shit. Oh man, especially like I've always had a sort of issue with whenever I have a injury or a tweak. Like I'm hyper aware of my body, and I'm way more aware now, especially when I smoke. So yesterday I smoked a bit and got like pretty high and was just like I don't want to say too hyper aware, but almost so aware that all of the considerations of like with my knee. Like I tweaked something, not sure what it is. I really don't think it's anything that bad. But at the same time, anything is in play because I don't know because I have a doctor's appointment Thursday, so I'm not going to know until then. I keep going back to like, this is a good practice in letting go of any assumptions that I hold on to. But whether it's that or just some fleeting thought that comes up that I pay attention to, it's like, oh, I got to figure that out. What if this happens? What if that happens? Which is, I used to live in that spot of hypotheticals without any awareness that all of those are bullshit. Like all those thoughts, things I'm going through in my head are not the truth and never the truth. And so it's been interesting going back and forth, like being almost feeling like I'm back being in the spot when I was younger with just a totally different perspective on it, more awareness of it, more appreciation for that experience. Whereas before, which provides me with so much more context to the human experience in general, whereas before there just wasn't as much awareness of it. Like I was feeling pretty good and I didn't really feel like I had to feel those things anymore, or there was a worthwhile way, which I think was reflected in my content. Like a lot of my content was less day to day on the ground applicable and more like, you know, discussing the reality of what you are, which again is connected to all of this. But on top of that, which I'll leave it at there for now, but on top of that, I've been in more spots of quote unquote like clarity. Like I was feeling super clear the other day, seeing how, of course, conceptual ideas allows you to feel like there's other people, but that's the only reason that I perceive other people to exist. And without those, it's just interacting with myself. And like I was in that spot for a while, and then it was like ran back to the other end of the spectrum. It's like fucking back and forth as opposed to being more in a, I don't know, like middle ground. But anyway, it's been fucking interesting to say the least the last week or so.
Yeah, that's going to happen again. It really just, I don't know. It's not to put too fine a point on it. Everything that we've been dealing with for the last year and a half, while it has gotten very deep, has also been kind of superficial. And what I mean is that we're dealing with a certain amount of information in any given conversation, but the more information you are open to, the deeper the conversation becomes for you. But that also means the more entangled the conversation becomes for you. And, it's funny, we talk about thoughts and false certainty acting as kind of like a shield for us against reality. And another way to put it would be, so if you were to close your eyes just for a moment, listener, Andrew, whoever it is you are, you know who you are. You're sitting and you're floating in space, and when you start your life, you're floating in this entire reality of uncertainty. There are so many different possible perceptions. There's so many different possible decisions and choices and assumptions and ideas. And so as you go through life, you start grabbing onto some of these, and rather than thinking of it as building a shield, think of it as building the ground. Like you're taking all of these assumptions of who your family is, where you live, what it means about you, what your beliefs are, and all of this, and they become kind of the ground for you. Now you're not floating in this space of uncertainty with all these potential thoughts and ideas. You have something that you're standing on. You feel rooted in this, and it gives you that sense of certainty. And you don't recognize after a while that now you're building stuff on top of that ground. Now you're taking new thoughts, new ideas that add to the ground that you've formed, and now you're building it on top of there. And so each time you build new and new layers, and you don't recognize how much you've buried underneath. It's kind of like digging for fossil fuels because of all the dinosaur bones and whatnot. They're so far under the earth. Well, that's how much shit we have created in our life. That's how much ground we've made through all of these assumptions. It's quite thick. And so as we start to question the ground that we're standing on, it kind of starts to unravel. And all of a sudden we find another layer deeper that we had built earlier on that has more considerations, because now we're closer to the ground level. We're closer to that original uncertainty that we had been struggling to build against, struggling to hold on to something to avoid. And so every time you go deeper, every time you start to unravel your shit, you become more aware of where you came from. You become more aware of all of those possible choices that have always been there, that you've been avoiding by clustering them together and saying, no, this is it. This is what's the truth. This is my ground. And so inevitably, as you go closer and closer to the original ground floor, you get closer and closer to sitting just within that space of potential again. And that's where you're free. But it's a lot. It's intense. And that's what you're experiencing. Is the deeper you go, the more you become aware of, which is what you started out being aware of, but couldn't handle. And so you ran from it. It's the best I can explain.
I was enjoying that a lot, and I think that definitely resonates quite a bit, because like it's almost like you can't know what you don't know, and until you know, and that's kind of where I've been at is like there's so much more. And I was coming at it from the perspective of exploring like outside myself. And I've always been hesitant to say like inside versus outside myself, but I'm going to stop doing that because there is a the and I'm even hesitant to like say this because I know the reality is that there is no inside or outside. But at the same time, there's the experience of inside and outside that impacts everything that we do. Like where I'm coming from is what I've been talking about is like the story isn't just the conceptual story. Like it's everything. It's every component of you. It's not ever the truth of what you are, but there's been so much investment in that just pushing it aside or setting it aside or separating yourself from that as opposed to looking at how it was built, why it was built, where it was coming from when it was built is almost downplaying a massive component of the experience of the dualistic experience. And so it's been very interesting, like, I don't know, just seeing the importance. And again, it's a balance because I don't want to take the story to be the truth, which I know that it's not, but also recognize its existence, I guess. Whereas I think before I was almost pushing it off as if it wasn't a thing at all. And so it's been kind of interesting, like being willing, and it's almost like takes some strength to be willing to look at the story and the discomforts that I tried to avoid or push away or numb myself from that built everything that I am, the ways that I act, the things that I do, the things that I say, and all of that, as opposed to just pushing it off as I'm just here now. That's it, which is true, but there's also a lot that's gone into building out. Like there's a lot of layers to the ground that I'm standing on because I'm still perceiving myself to be standing on ground, whether or not I'm standing on ground. There is still a lot of layers there. And I think I almost was able to maintain the perspective that I was floating despite standing on the ground. And I didn't want to look at the fact that there was a lot of layers to that ground because that's what I did for so long was build those layers to separate myself from those things that I didn't want to look at or those things that I didn't want to feel as much or experience as much. Whereas, I don't know, in the last week, 2, 3 weeks, I've been coming back to being willing to look at the ground and look at the layers and kind of dig in to those and see more and recognize, I don't know, more of the context of where everything that I do comes from, which again, there's a reason that I avoided looking at that for so long because it was uncomfortable. And so, of course, looking at it is going to be uncomfortable. And that's what I'm realizing now, just how much of that story I didn't even want to look at any of it or even give any credence to any of its impact. Whereas now I am at least a little bit more, I guess.
See, there's a danger that goes with getting deeper, which is falling back into the habit of giving your narrative too much importance, and that's kind of what's happening here. And so, I want to caution you about the difference between what you've experienced versus what you perceived yourself to have experienced, because there is a difference between your experience and your perceptions of that experience. You're looking back at the reasons that you are the way you are, but you're not. You're looking at your perceptions of the reasons you are the way you are. The reason you are the way you are is because of everything that you experienced. The distortion, the suffering, the consequence, all of that stuff is the perception of those experiences. That's what you're sorting through. You just got a deeper appreciation of how many perceptions you have. How long it took to build all these perceptions, how, in 10th grade, for example, when you got called out by a teacher or something like that, you perceived that to be embarrassing. You perceived that to be something that diminished your value. You perceived it in a bunch of ways that rippled for the rest of your 10th grade year, let's just say, and even onward. All that, though, is just your perception of the change that happened to you. All of that is your egotistical view of what happened to Andrew, as opposed to where Andrew fit into the whole, where Andrew fit into the rest of you. And that's, as always, the danger when we look farther back and we get a deeper appreciation of how much of our story, how much perception, how much narrative we really built up over time. It's so tempting to forget that you are not just Andrew, right? You've never just been Andrew. And in all of those memories that you're having now, there are other people that were impacted. And you have to start looking at those impacts too, that you served a purpose outside of just whatever it is you thought you were perceiving, right? Because there are differences. And I say this from experience. I say this from somebody who's gone back over memories more times than I can count and found new perceptions of each memory every time, right? It's not the perceptions that really happen, because we're always continuing to change. Whatever happened is what happened. That's the change that you experienced. Your perception is the distortion. Your perception is the interpretation. Your perception is just what you could chew on right now. And as you explore more perceptions of that past, which comes from accepting that it does not define you, it does not limit you, it does not in any way constrict you whatsoever, your perceptions of your past can change fluidly right now, changing the past itself to some degree. So just remember, when we talk about the narrative, we're not talking about our perceptions of what happened, or rather we are talking about our perceptions of what happened. When we talk about the experience we've had, though, it's always here and now. It's only ever been here and now.
That definitely helps. All right. So that's the balance. I'm glad we're getting into this now, because this is what I've kind of been almost going back and forth with. And that is a very, very helpful reminder to understand that my perception of the experience is not the experience itself. And even there's been so many like different ways I've looked at things, not with necessarily objective truth, but just seeing it from different perspectives. And especially the one in which, growing up in the way that I did, I, from an outsider's perspective, didn't necessarily go through like relatively comfortable upbringing. And so in order to shake someone who has a comfortable upbringing, like they have to, it's almost like, I don't know, they have to experience some degree of suffering, like in the way that I did, to shake them enough. And so I'm seeing that everything that I went through, regardless of my perception of it now, got me to see things from a different point of view. Like got me to have a lot of empathy for people who go through things. Whereas, say hypothetically, I didn't experience that. Like I never got caught in those things, was just like a super confident kid, like never struggled with that stuff. There's a good chance there's been many examples of people who have gone down that trajectory and they, from society's point of view, have a great life and they keep having a great life for themselves. They don't have, and I'm not saying that I'm having all this impact and doing all this good shit all the time, but like they don't have any understanding of what that's like. Like if you don't go through that experience, you can't understand. You can't even blame someone who doesn't understand what that experience is like if they haven't gone through it. It's just they haven't. They couldn't possibly know. So you have to experience it for yourself. You can't just read a book about suffering. You can't just talk to someone who's suffered. You can't just sit in a room with someone who's lost in their mind, believing every thought that they think is the truth. You have to experience it for yourself. And so even just that point of view, I'm like, okay, so it was kind of in a sense necessary, all of those experiences, but at the same time, my perception of those experiences are not how they went. And so looking back at certain things, like when we at the end of the retreat there, the experience I had towards the end where I re-experienced basically my experience of hell, like seeing that, my perception of that experience and how I felt, the weight of it was just because of my own assumptions of how I fit in to the situation and how I felt and how I should have been acting relative to how I was acting, how I perceived other people to be perceiving me, which is not how they're perceiving me. Like, we don't know how someone's perceiving us ever, 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 ever. You're sitting in a room feeling like everyone's judging you. That's just because you want to know how they're thinking about you, because you'd rather know that they're judging you than not know what they're thinking, because you can never know how they're perceiving a situation from their point of view. You can only see things from your point of view and make assumptions based upon that. And so, yeah, I don't know. There's just like so many ways to go about things, and part of me is hesitant to dig back in to the story like I was talking about at the start, because again, the story is just a story. The story is not reality. My perception of how it went isn't how it went. So I don't know. It's been an interesting balance between like knowing how that feels and still kind of feeling that like those things have come up and gone through. Whereas before the last month, like they weren't as much, but like at the same time, they still were. And I just wanted to think that they weren't. Like I'm seeing experiences I've had over the last year and a half, like remembering certain things and seeing that there was some of that there, and I just skirted it in a way. Like I subtly avoided the situation, like, was out and like had another beer or something, just different. There's so many ways to distract or feeling a little bit uncomfortable, pull your phone out, turn on the TV, all that shit. Whereas, when you don't run for those things as much, you're able to those things that are kind of poking through the surface, you're able to look at and be like, wait a second, there's a lot of discomfort there. Why is that the case? Where is that coming from? Why? Whereas I think a lot of my experience has been, a little bit of discomfort. And like, it's not to say that I always ran from it. There were plenty of times where I haven't. Like, I don't want to discount that I've like fucking never went through anything at all and like avoided all discomfort for the last year and a half or whatever. But I'm seeing that there were points where I did that I didn't even think twice about. And it would like come up and pass super quick because I just kind of skirted in a way. Whereas the last couple of weeks I didn't. And that's what allowed me to see it. But now I don't know. It's kind of along the lines of what you were saying. Like now trying to find a balance between getting caught and in taking the story to be any degree of the truth and understanding that it never, ever, ever is. And that I am still just here now. Like I'm not Andrew. I am still just what is here and now. And any degree of a story that I'm telling myself isn't it. And so that's where I was at for a while. And now it's like I'm just taking in more, like seeing more consideration. So it's not like a black and white thing anymore. It's not just like, oh, thinking about something that happened, irrelevant. I'm just here now. It's like it's like there's a little more to it, I
Yes,
guess.
yes. There is more to it, and it's just that it's not irrelevant. It's just okay. So here's the easiest and quickest way to disempower your narrative. Don't judge it. Just don't judge the experience. Don't judge yourself for going through the perception. Don't judge yourself for playing out the avoidance. Don't judge yourself for being resistant. Don't judge yourself for not seeing what it is you were avoiding. Don't judge yourself for going through the experience that caused the avoidance to begin with. And the reason is because as soon as you judge it, it just became more narrative. Now it's a perception again of how you're doing and what it means about you and all that stuff, instead of just a recognition of what you've gone through and how it changed you and the impact that that has. The recognition, as we said in season 1, is the one-step process. The recognition is what sets you free. It's what allows you to change, right? Because what's the opposite of avoidance? Recognition, right? And that's it. That's all it is. It's just sitting through it. And that's the process that you're going through right now. You sank a little deeper, and now you're having more in terms of past narrative, past perceptions, past habits, past ideas of Andrew that are popping up. And each one you have to look at and not judge. Not judge the perception, not judge yourself for holding on to it, not judge the person that may be hammered into your head, not judge the situation that forced you to cling to it, not judge any of it, to look at it, to empathize with yourself, to empathize with the people that possibly reinforced that, to empathize with the entire creation of this fucking thing that's been haunting you for years, and just accept it. Just accept it. And then it passes and you let it go. And that's the healing process. Right? This is what people with trauma are going through all the time. This is what healing is accepting your demons as angels, turning your weaknesses into strengths, turning the things that poisoned you into things that make you stronger.
So there, okay, yeah, that makes sense. In the judgment, obviously, I think that's sometimes where I get caught in that, and again, that just creates more narrative, and it's like having a thought and then judging it, and then it just spirals from there, as opposed to seeing it for what it is and seeing like I guess the neutrality in it, in a sense too, like all those situations that I perceive to be difficult or tough, or it's not to say that they weren't, but they weren't bad also. There's a side of me that very much appreciates every situation that I went through. Like there's an understanding that I wouldn't be where I'm at in the same way without every experience that I've ever had in my entire life. And so it got me here, so it can't be bad. And it's not even that it got me here because I've never left here, but it's I guess that like being willing to look at it without judgment is massive, because there was an assumption of judgment before, I think, that caused me to not want to look at it, or there was so much discomfort that came along with it that I just didn't even want to take a peek. Whereas starting to take a peek, there is so much there that I want to judge it, like that I want to say that it's uncomfortable or bad or whatever. Yeah, and settle upon a certainty of it. But I can't be certain about that either, about any situation ever. Like we look at certain situations in this silo, like separate from everything else, which allows us to think that it's even possible to judge a situation. Like it's impossible to come to a conclusion about a situation, because there is no situation that exists in silo. None of them exist in a vacuum. They're all having impact on everything else, and everything else is having impact on it all the time. There's no such thing as a separate situation. There's no such thing as a separate event. They don't exist. And so without that, there's the willingness to look at a section of the situation that is just reality here now, that always has been and always will be, but in order to judge it in any capacity, you have to conceptually divide it from every other experience that you ever have, as opposed to just seeing that it's always been you here now experiencing the rest of yourself, and we just layer on all of those assumptions, like you were talking about at the start of this episode, with kind of laying that groundwork of assumption, as opposed to floating in uncertainty And as we lay that groundwork, we build more on top of it, because it almost comes with it. As soon as we lay that groundwork, there's always more being built on top of it, as long as we're making assumptions about the things that are happening, what they mean about us, where we fit in the situation, which none of it we can ever possibly know. So like, we're still like, we're always floating in that uncertainty, just convincing ourselves that we're not, by laying that groundwork. And so I think, yeah, it's been an interesting, it's just been an interesting sort of, I want to say balance, but it's not even that, because it's not even like maintaining, it's not about looking at it and like kind of balancing, like kind of judging it and kind of not. It's like, no, none of the judgments are ever going to be it or the truth. So they're like, it's just something that you don't have to do. And it's still happening. Like, everything I'm going through is still being processed, whether I'm making assumptions about it or not. And the assumptions that I make, the judgments I make about past memories or current experiences, actually just get in the way of the processing.
As we've said many times, the experience is what it is. And there are infinite perceptions of what it is, right? But they all impact us in that they all provide additional context to whatever our experience is becoming, because we all have this dualistic I guess journey from birth to death, as it were, and so that experience is increasing context over time, but we don't recognize how far back that goes or how primal those experiences are. And so um, come with me again, dear listener. If you want to close your eyes for this, you can do that. But let's imagine that you are just coming into the world. In fact, you haven't even come into the world yet. You are just aware of yourself in this warm little cocoon where you are safe and fed and nourished and everything is okay. And then all of a sudden you come out into the world and you're no longer safe. You're no longer in this little cocoon. You're no longer alone. There are dangers. There's the unknown. There's air. There's light. There's sound. There's people talking really loud. There's something in the background that sounds like a melody. You don't know what music is. You've never heard it before, and you're cold and you're shivering. And now you've been taken in a blanket, and you've never felt fabric before, so that's different. And you're finally held by something, by someone, and they seem familiar, and they're holding you, and you feel better, and that uncertainty starts to fade, and finally you feel like you can rest, and you start to fall asleep, and you do, and you fall asleep, and you feel just at peace, because once again you feel at least safe from all of this uncertainty that you just fucking plunged into. And a little while later, all of a sudden you're brought to what is called your bed or your crib, which of course is not something you've ever been familiar with, and you're placed down in it, in this what seems like a very large area by yourself. And then this one thing, this person, this presence that's making you feel safe suddenly leaves the room, and you have no concept of how long you've been here, how long you will be here. This is the first time that you felt discomfort and then comfort, and then someone took that comfort away. And it feels like every joy in your life has just suddenly left, like it might never come back. And all of the fear of that pops up, and you cry and you scream and you wail, and everything in you shakes because it was the only comfort you had in this experience. And then that person comes back, and you start to recognize that maybe you overreacted, that time is longer than you thought, that perhaps, it's not as bad as you thought, as you think. And this person has the opportunity, this presence has the opportunity to reinforce that over your life, or not. And some of us don't get that reinforcing, and we end up with parents that are neglectful. And so that fear never ever goes away. It just gets translated into every other relationship we have, into every other friendship we have, into every other marriage or girlfriend or boyfriend or anything like that. It's always that fear of them leaving us, because we never ever had it reaffirmed. And even if we did, that primal fear will always be there, and it will be triggered as we get older and we meet people. If we don't address it and re-perceive it and understand where it came from, and have the strength as we get older to go back to that original suffering and show ourselves empathy, because of course we were afraid. Of course it seemed like hell to lose that presence. We didn't know any better. We do now. And so we can take that moment and heal ourselves through it. We can re-perceive it and change everything that happened afterwards.
That was dope. I was once yeah, I mean I was like fully following that from the experience of leaving the womb to sitting in a crib with the lights off and just seeing that throughout our lives. And then I got to the point where it was like first day of school and re-experiencing that feeling of stepping onto the bus, you know, getting picked up at the end of my driveway every time. Like when we're kids, we're stepping into uncertainty all the time with so little context of like a broader perspective of I'm going to school, going to be here for the next, you know, 15 years or so in some capacity and all of these things, like, because we don't know that. We don't know what's going to happen over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And so at that point, we couldn't even possibly understand that. So we don't even know. Fuck, I'm even getting the feelings of going to school for the first day and not having any idea how long a school day is. You know, like getting on the bus and going to school, not really knowing anyone with a bunch of kids who are like 4 or 5 years old. And it's like, I guess preschool, you get some of that too, but kindergarten, for whatever I remember, that point, because maybe that's the first time I rode the bus and kind of was at a new school, it was a bigger school, and just holy fuck, like there was no like there was no prep for that whatsoever. It is just raw uncertainty. And so we go through that experience, gain a little bit more context, understanding. By the end of that year, you know, we're stepping on that bus with an entirely different perspective than we
And
did
assumptions.
on the first day. And with that comes a whole bunch of assumptions. And then we carry those assumptions into the following year, into the next experience, into the next experience. And then all of a sudden, something doesn't meet our assumptions. We get blindsided. You know, we thought someone was friends with us and they weren't, or they didn't like us anymore. Or one day we show up and they're like, yeah, we're not friends anymore. And it's like all of this false certainty that you'd kind of built up to that point gets bashed and you feel bad. And then you get over it and you know, find some other friends. And then you go through that whole experience. But to a degree, that feeling kind of stays with you. Maybe now going into situations, you have a little more hesitancy. You know, you're not as willing to go all in to a situation. You keep some things at bay, you know, you keep some hesitancy to the next time you step into things. And the same thing happens with love. You know, first time someone falls in love, their heart gets broken. The next time they step into something, they weren't as forthright as the first time. And that's our experience over and over and over. And we rarely take a reset and recognize, oh, none of those things meant anything about me. I perceived them to mean something about me. I perceived them in a certain way based on the context that I had at the moment, but then we don't reassess down the road when we have more context. And so we're carrying our perception of a situation even right now inside of us. When we're, say, that example of being 5 years old and like making a friend and then that friend leaving you and making other friends and ditching you, like our perception of the heartbreaking experience of that with no context, we then build on top of that. Like that is a layer of us that goes unquestioned for years. And so we bring that hesitancy into situations. And that's why like people are adults and they're guarded and like they don't really know why, because maybe they had an experience when they were 5 years old that caused them to be more guarded and they've just suppressed that experience, but the
No,
way
no,
that
I have bipolar.
oh fuck. So like oh, there's so many things that come from that. And then we perceive ourselves to just be a certain way because we have no understanding of where it came from because we don't want to look at it because it was so uncomfortable that we just buried that shit so deep. And yet, of course, it's still having impact, but it's having impact as if we're a 5-year-old having the context of that and the impact of that. And then we just build on top of that. And the next situation we go into, we're changed after that. We're almost like forever changed until we are willing to go look back into it and see it from a different perspective. But until we do so, which most people just don't because it's uncomfortable and scary, which is why they avoid it in the first place, it will continue to have impact. And we don't know why.
And the alternative is, of course, feeling like you do this week. Because that's it. Like, this is why we say, like, it's funny because at the retreat this time around, I think the expression that a bunch of people came up with was, a good place to work through your shit, or something like that. And personally, I prefer an expression that you came up with, I think about a month ago, staring down the barrel. Because to me, that's what you're doing. You're looking straight at the source of everything that's causing you fear, which is all of the shit that you haven't looked at yet. And it's not about fixing it. It's about looking at it without judgment, because it's the judgment that's continuing to get in your way. It's the judgment of everything you've been through that's continuing to traumatize you. It's the judgment of everything that you've experienced that's continuing to make you think that there is something fucking wrong with you when there isn't. Your experiences are not your perceptions of your experiences. Your experiences are like paints. And now you can take those paints and you can mix them together in whatever perception you want and whatever color you want. You can paint whatever kind of life you want from your perception of those experiences. Or you can let all of those perceptions go and recognize that they're all valid from a certain point of view. But the important part is that you are here now, which has been the important part the entire fucking time. But we didn't know that, which is why all these perceptions built up over time, because we thought they were important.
Exactly. And so yeah, I mean, I'm seeing all this from a totally different perspective, and the staring down the barrel. I like that. And that's even making more sense today than it has in the past because that's what it is. It's staring down. It's as if it's a barrel through the middle of all of our experiences, and there's all of these experiences, almost like I don't know if you've ever seen the Atlantis like water slide that has like the sharks swimming around it, and like you're in a tube that goes through it, and it's like all of your experiences are all there, and we have a judgment about every single one, but none of those judgments are correct. We have a perception of every single experience, and we've just maintained that assumption throughout our whole life, like we made it in the moment, and then we just never it went unquestioned, so it just built on top of that, and the barrel lengthened with each and every experience, and we never want to look back at the fucking barrel down those experiences, and we have to it's almost like the process of that. I don't know, maybe it isn't this, but it's like it has to go. Yeah, it probably doesn't have to go in linear order because it's kind of irrelevant anyway, but it's just like the willingness to look at where some of those things came from. And there's certain experiences that had more or less impact, but then every experience after said experience continued it on without question. And so it's both looking down the barrel, but also questioning it in the moment, in the experience. Like, where is that coming from right now? And understanding that it doesn't mean anything about you, even when it comes up, those feelings now still doesn't mean anything about you, just like it didn't mean anything about you back then when it happened. And so I guess, yeah, it's like looking back, like the balance of looking back without judgment and being here without judgment, and but also not. So like with I guess I'm curious then with looking down the barrel, you're still here now going through that. So it's not so much an action of looking into your past, it's just a willingness to not avoid the discomfort when it comes up, which will allow you to see maybe a little bit more where it's coming from. Like, you'll be shown a little bit of where it's coming from and then be able to look at it without judgment, because you're not looking at it with judgment right now.
That's the thing, right? Like, the judgment is what creates the fear. The fear is the bullet you're staring at, right? That's the thing that's been threatening you the whole time, is a bullet that you've put there just by judging the situation and judging your value and judging your worth and judging how you reacted to it and everything else. And so staring down the barrel is how you remove the bullet. That's it. It's just staring at it, looking at it until you just go, oh, wow, that's a lot. And that's the thing. Like, a lot of us don't recognize that. We'll look back at high school, for example, and we'll judge ourselves for something that we did. And then we'll take it totally out of context. We won't recognize all of the things that led up to it, all of the other impacts, the fact that we didn't know what the fuck we knew now by any means. Like, this is all stuff that we had to learn. And that's actually what led us to learning what we know now. Like, all of that stuff without judgment, all of a sudden you're just like, oh, wow, there's a lot more impact from that moment than I thought. Here, I just thought it forced me to be socially anxious. I didn't actually think it. It also reinforced the idea that I don't know what to say. Like things like that. There's so much that we've taken in along the journey. I do want to address a question here quickly. How much longer are you guys going to be live here for? We're going to be here for about a half hour. After that half hour, we are going to be jumping onto Patreon for a tier 2 and a tier 3 call. So 3 hours of live group discussions after this. If you would like to join us, patreon.com/dualistic unity. You can also click the QR code or rather snap or photo the QR code or whatever it is you do with that thing. I just aged myself. Anyway, join us on Patreon. There's a 7-day free trial available, and you can chat with us up to 5 days a week. And we're going to be there for the rest of Sunday morning, at least. So if you can join us, that'd be great. Aside from that, Andrew, how do I accomplish my dreams? That is a question specifically for you. We're going to go on a bit of a tangent here, but before we do that, I wanted to kind of wrap this up and just come back to the point. This shit's hard. I've said this since day one. I've said this since the very first season. The deeper you go, the more aware you become of everything that's influencing you. That's really all it is. It's just what's influencing you. And it's influencing you because of a lack of awareness of it, because you're avoiding it, because it's uncomfortable, and ultimately because there's something in terms of the source of your fear in all of these thoughts and judgments. And so that's what it is recognizing you don't have to be afraid of your past. You don't have to be afraid of a perception of your past that ultimately isn't the truth. That's ultimately why we don't look back. We're like, oh my God, it's always going to be like this. It's like, no, that's just your perception. If you can change your understanding of yourself, then your perception of the past will change accordingly, right? Your past is not what you think it is. It's whatever you make of it.
Yeah, that's a very important one to keep in mind. Just that it's never what you think it is, ever, which can be uncomfortable. Like, even saying that right now, understanding, and it's the same for your experience right now. And so, as you maintain that perspective that your thoughts about what's happening right now isn't actually what's happening right now, like your perception of other people, your ideas that you're maintaining of a certain situation of other people aren't the reality of what they are. And so, as you maintain that understanding as you go through your life moving forward, there to isn't so much more built on all of those layers that you've built to this point. And so it's both not adding layers and being willing to look down that barrel at where all of them are coming from that chips away at them. But at the same time, if we're looking down the barrel and judging it, we're both, it's like we're looking down at it. So there's a degree of chipping away, but we're judging it. So there's layers being built at the same time.
Just
And it's
made the
almost,
bullet like more dangerous. You turned it
yeah,
from a bullet into like a hollow point.
yeah, exactly. And so if we're willing to look back, but then we're continuing to judge as we go, it's like there's nothing being chipped away at, or it's both being built upon as it's being chipped away at, and so there's not anything being let go of. And even this, like, I feel like is getting I'm conceptualizing it in a massive way, even as we're talking right now. Like,
No other way to talk.
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point.
But
Because
this is the thing: is, remember, like, we're using analogies, we're using examples, we're trying to describe the process of the experience, like, and that's it. Like, we're not using anything that's remotely close to the all and everything of what it is we're experiencing, but at least it gives us some kind of a easy way to communicate an aspect of what it is that we're going through. And so, as with even looking back at the past, it's important not to judge how you're communicating what you're going through either. I mean, this is the best that you can do based on what you know. And likewise for me, right? But this is it: is you can stare at the past, but if you're not letting go of your fear, which means letting go of your entrenched perception of the past, then the fear never goes away. That bullet will always influence you. That's the thing: is you have to look at it, and you have to look at the impact it had, not on you then, but on all of you, which includes what you do with it now. I mean, that's really the big thing. Like, when you look back to that bully who was picking on you in grade 4 or something like that, you can look back and go, I should have stood up for myself. I feel shamed. Or maybe you did and you hurt the kid, or whatever it might be. It's easy to judge yourself. It's easy to look at the next year, the year after that, the year after that, all the years after that, and go, oh my God, I'm such an idiot. Why did I do that? But you're sitting here right now looking back at it, which means that you can learn from it, which means that everything from there taught you to what you are learning right now, and your whole life has changed. And there's nothing wrong with it taking, quote unquote, that long, because that's how hard it's going to settle into you. You have all of those years of barrel that now you get to deal with, and all the fear that was at the end of that barrel because you didn't want to look down. It's too long, it's too much. And now you're doing it right now. That's all that matters. That's all that matters, because perhaps you needed to hit rock bottom hundreds of times in order to learn how not to. Don't judge yourself for it. I've said many times I'm a slow learner. I made rock bottom my home.
yeah, so all right, I might have some more questions with this just because it's very applicable to everything I'm going through now. Like, when things come up, then, like, part of me wants to figure out what to do, like, if there's something to do with it. And I know there's not, and it's just, like, already in process. But there's part of me, and maybe this is something that I'm getting caught on, is like that experience I had that Sunday, going through kind of reliving a hell. I never got to a spot, and part of the reason I kept going back into it was because there was a part of me that wanted to get to a spot where I, like, you know, released it or whatever. Because, like, because I've had there was another time on a trip where I re-experienced a situation that I went through when I was younger, and then it kind of, like, maybe it was just my perception of how the trip went, but it kind of, like, almost felt like it cleared itself up in that experience. Like, it ended with everything went white, and it was just, like, sort of a euphoric thing, and it was great, and it felt good and didn't feel as concerned
It's like that
afterwards.
sometimes.
Yeah, and this one wasn't like that, and part of the reason I kept going back was because I wanted to, like, reframe my perspective of the experience, and I never really did that. Like, I felt the weight and the gravity of it and the fear and all of it, and then I just came out of it kind of with it still.
Yep.
There wasn't. Yeah.
Because so it's interesting because this wasn't just one insight. This just wasn't one moment. You were looking back at a collective of moments and ripples that kind of carried on with you through your life. But these are all ripples that have changed how you impact everyone, how you talk to everyone. I know since talking to you since then, you've mentioned, like, I'm very different with people. Like, I'm talking to people differently. I'm showing more empathy. I'm tending to be more patient. I can see where they're coming from. This is how you get past this, is the application in what you do. Because what you've recognized is how much of what you do is influenced by how you used to perceive things. Now you get to change what you do. Now you're reestablishing new actions rather than relying on old reactions. And as you do so, you're going to start to feel better, because that's the process of letting that old perception go, is to let the old habits that went with it go. So in this case, it's kind of like giving up an addiction.
Yeah. Okay. That that makes sense then, and because it has added just a lot of context to everything, like my entire experience. Like I do see things a lot differently, and there's also like the maintenance of the understanding, and even since in the last week, like that the visceral feeling of being in it that kind of stayed with me for a bit has kind of died off a little bit, because there was a point during that trip where I was like, "Fuck, is this gonna stay with like, am I straight up, like, back where I started?" I said it a couple times in the past week, but, like, I felt like, there was the concern of, did I lose all my progress? Did I lose everything that I've ever learned since that point? And I haven't, but there was still a lot of those feelings arising. Like, for the most basic situations, I was like, I'm concerned about I'm like, my heart's beating out of my chest for the most basic interaction that I felt like had never happened in my life before. Like, what the fuck is going on? And like, I'm not getting so many of those feelings anymore. They've kind of petered off since. And I know one of the things you said to be mindful of was trying to forget that experience, forget the feeling. And so it's been interesting because it's not as right there all the time. Like, there's not my heart hasn't raced much, because like it hasn't for a while in that same sort of way. Maybe it has, and I've just, run from that feeling. But what I'm saying is I haven't been sitting in that in the same way that I was like Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, kind of. Maybe it's like petered off, but I don't know, like how much of it is maintained just through not running from it, and how much is it like that I'm like, is there a part of me that should try to remember that feeling?
No, well, I would just watch out for trying to forget. That's all, right? And so, see, this is the thing. Like, we tend to go, "Oh my god, I feel shitty again. I must be backsliding," instead of looking at how that quote unquote shitty feeling has influenced every action that we're taking, every comment that we make, every response that we have, right? That's the indicator of what you're doing, is the fact that all of a sudden you're softening your approach. You're being a little bit more hesitant before making an assumption. You're checking yourself when you're about to tell somebody what's wrong with them, that kind of thing. Like, all of a sudden all of that's changing. And it's because there's a depth that you've found. There's more sensitivity that you've found, but that sensitivity comes from an increase in awareness of all of the considerations, right? And so the reason that you're starting to feel better is because you're acting now from that state. So every time that you talk to somebody and you're like, oh, I don't have to defend myself, and all of a sudden that heartbeat starts to slow down, rather than the old response of, I'll just force my way past this moment, right? So I don't have to feel that heartbeat. So all of a sudden now you're changing your moment to moment strategies based on the experience of greater depth. And as you do that, as you get used to it, as you form new actions, and as you use your awareness to basically change these habits that have formed over time, you're going to start to feel better again. You're going to be like, oh yeah, I got this, I understand. And all of a sudden, it's not those considerations are ever going to go away. You have just changed as a result of that additional context, which is why you're going to be softer with people, which is why your approach to people is going to change. And then as you go farther, it's going to happen again, right? You're going to go even farther back, as I was saying, possibly as far back as birth and the crib and the first experience of feeling abandoned, because that's all stuff that's in there. That's all stuff that we don't look at, but it does influence us.
Yeah, I'm starting to understand more of that. You've talked in the past about, you know, remembering birth in a sense. And yeah, it's funny because I'm realizing more even that it's all in there. Like it's all in there. Even when I was going through expenses for the retreat, like going through that, like we had the payment at the that like med store, the cannabis spot that we went to for the last weekend, and I couldn't remember like what the ATM was like or like how much the cost was for the things, and I was trying to remember, and I couldn't even remember what the store was like. You know, I remembered the first one that we went to from the first weekend, and I couldn't remember that one. And I just kind of sat in that of like, it's in there somewhere. And then I found on Google Maps the location because it had the address on the ATM thing, and then I saw the location, and I like kind of closed my eyes and remembered walking into it, and then all of a sudden it all came back. Like the whole store, I could see there's like, you know, the ATM, there were ATM on the side, ATM in the back, bathroom on the side, and the counter we were at, and then all the details started coming back too, like the interactions that we had with the guys behind the counter. It all started coming back, and I was back in that spot with the entire context, and there was a good 10 minutes where I couldn't remember any of that. And so it was very, very interesting, and I'm seeing more and more how it is all in there. And it's like we come up with ways to for like forget or not remember or not try to remember, or like we say that we can't remember something, but how much is of that is just us either not wanting to or thinking that we can't, you know? And and once I kind of dropped that, then all of a sudden it came back, and it was like a crazy experience cuz I couldn't remember it at all, and then all of a sudden I remembered it, and then it all, like, started flooding back fully to I basically re-experienced the entire however, 10, 15 minutes we spent in there, and then I remembered all of it. It's like, I don't know, it's just interesting and how much of that is our entire experience. Like, all of our memories are in there, and we say we can't remember certain things, but I don't know how much of that is just not wanting to or thinking that we can't.
That's it. Or not acknowledging that we have the strength, not acknowledging that the bullet can't hurt us. Right. Like that's the thing is that, for me, especially in my life, as I've let go of all of my reasons for feeling I was good at or not good at, feeling I was strong or weak or anything, as I've just continued on through life, it's become more obvious that's what I can do. That however challenging things might be, I can rise to that challenge. And as that settled in, the things that I was afraid to look back at in my past suddenly became available. All of a sudden they would pop up. Things that I had gone to therapy and talked to people about having blank spots in my memories, sometimes months and even years of stuff just gone, was gone because frankly, I didn't think I had the strength to look at it. I had too many preferences about it. I had too many fears about it. And so my mind kept me safe from it by saying, don't worry, that's not there. In the same way that we can tune out a lot of fears by just ignoring them. That's what my brain did. Was it created a nice little comfortable place where I didn't have to acknowledge those memories were there. But a part of that too, and we've talked about this previously, is the fact that from developmental stage to developmental stage, however small or big those stages might be, we actually lose the capacity to remember how we used to think, because how we think now is so all encompassing. We forget that at one point, like, for example, do you remember when you didn't know how to read? Probably not. And it's because you read so often now. So you would actually have to put yourself in a mentality. You would have to put yourself willingly into a space where you can acknowledge that not being able to read is okay and not terrifying and doesn't have anything to do with you as a human being, doesn't have anything to do with your value, doesn't have all of this stuff. I mean, and how many things in the media, how many things in stories have you heard, what, you can't read, like that kind of thing. So there's so much fear of us even looking back at that memory because we've come so far since then, right? And there's all kinds of things that get in our way. And this is true for all of our developmental stages. This is why I find it funny that my daughter, who is just turned 16 recently, there are movies that she used to love when she was like 6 or 7. She can't even remember watching them. And we watched them frequently, right? And it's just because back then her brain worked very differently. Her perception of the world was very different. Her perception of herself was very different. She had less considerations, or the considerations were very different. Now it's like she has a whole new brain, almost like she's a whole new person. And it's so easy to forget that that's built on top of the ground that was built way back then.
So like sometimes we can think our brain is evolving, or our reality is evolving, which isn't false, but it's also, there's all of these things being built on top of each other that we have enough layers in between now in a certain situation that we just can't even tap back into what it was like to experience that. And our brain evolves with that, but it evolves based on the context that we're given throughout all of those layers. So it's like they kind of go hand in hand. The building, the evolving, the thinking certain things mean something about us stays with all of that, and like the assumptions that come with that, to the point that, as you said, there can be blank spots in our memory because we think something has such a big impact on us that it then does impact us, but we just don't even look at it. So it continues to have impact and we just don't look back, or don't almost allow ourselves, or our mind thinks it's keeping us safe because that was perceived as a dangerous situation or event, whether it was physically dangerous or mentally dangerous, because we maintain the idea of ourself that a mentally, psychologically, quote unquote, dangerous situation would be something that our mind tries to protect us from. And so those are being built in the background all the time, having impact on us as we go, and we don't even want to admit that it is, or that things are playing roles in our experience, that everything is always playing a role in our experience. But at the same time, it comes back to where you're at and the situation, and what you're currently going through, and the practice is letting go of your assumptions of what you're currently going through and what it means about you. And as you're willing to do that, you can start digging in to the impacts that are being had based on all the other situations that you've been through that you're assuming to have impact. But as long as you're continuing to assume that current situations mean something about you, you're never going to be able to dig in to the previous situations that are continuing to have impact.
Now, that's a great point. And this kind of leads me to, I think, where we're going to start closing out, because this is important. Usually, and I know this is especially true in therapy and psychology and things like that, what we do is you go, oh, there are things in my history, in my childhood, in my past that are influencing me. I need to go digging through that shit. I need to deliberately look back at the past, dredge all that up, and then try to deal with it with the lack of skills that I've currently developed for dealing with now. Can't imagine why that's going to go badly, right? And so the trick is not to go deliberately backwards, but to look at what it is you're avoiding right now. If you are avoiding shame, fear, guilt, regret, any of these things, if these are the emotions, these are the perceptions that you're avoiding, that you're desperately covering up, that you're desperately trying to run past, that you're desperately trying to distract yourself from, that's the problem. Accept those feelings. Look at them for what they are. Question them. Understand that they're not what they appear to be. They're just one perception of what you're experiencing. Just like the experiences of the past, there's the experience and your perception of that experience. Guilt, regret, shame, all that stuff at the lower energetic level are basically just perceptions that you're locked on. So when you're in that perception here, disempower it. Stare down the tiny barrel of what's happening right now. and it's easier to disempower that bullet. And then as you do that and you get better at it, you'll start to be able to look at the longer barrels, the ones that go farther back. But it's disempowering it now. It's understanding that those experiences that you're afraid to go through can't hurt you. Stop arming more bullets down more barrels, because they'll just haunt you for the rest of your life. You're just leaving them in the past, and they are all following you now, like longer and longer barrels. And you're building more as you go, just through being afraid of these experiences. So as you do that, you start to disarm the smaller ones, and then you can disarm the longer ones, and then you can disarm the ones that you weren't even willing to look at. But there's so many in the way right now, you have to deal with ones that are right in front of you, which are the ones that you're creating now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Like, because they're going to come up. Like, they're going to come up here and now. And they're a component of what's coming up here and now. Like, they're not separate. They're just more to what you're experiencing right now. And so people will get very caught in trying to look back almost as a means of avoidance of what's happening right now, what they're going through right now. They want to look back and be like, oh, that's going to solve everything if I can let go of that. But if you can't let go of this, how are you going to let go of that? And if you can let go of that, but you can't let go of this, you're just going to keep building shit as you go anyway, and eventually have to work through that. And so, yeah, before we hop off, because we did acknowledge the how can I accomplish my dreams comment in there. So I'll just touch on that quick. How do you accomplish your dreams? That's a great question. I have no fucking idea. Because I can't tell you how something's going to happen. I think there's so much to a question like that we're not going to be able to get into on this. Feel free to bring it up on Patreon at some point, because we answer all the questions there. But yeah, I think it's important to question why right now, if you think that accomplishing that dream will make you better than where you are now, why that's the case. This manifestation series will certainly help. That's on the screen. It's not the mainstream spiritual manifesting shit at all. It's the reality of what manifestation is and the experience that you're having moment to moment, because it's not about escaping it. It's not about just getting to another spot if you're not feeling whole right now. It's about coming back to what's actually real and the entirety of your experience that impacts and influences everything else that you're going through. Because your experience is always here now, no matter what you gain, no matter what you accomplish, no matter what you go through, you'll always be you here now. And so that's super important to keep in mind as you're going through the process of trying to become something more, because that's based on a massive assumption that you can become something more, which will also cause you to think that you can become less if it doesn't happen. And so it's very important to be able to look at those and where they're coming from, and the reality that you can't become more. And because you can't become more, you can't become less. And being free in yourself is the ultimate thing that pretty much everyone's looking for, and they use getting things to feel that way, but that is available to you right now. And so I think that that series will be super helpful and just relevant to a question like that, because we go into it in great detail.
Agreed. The manifestation series is fantastic. I'm very happy with it, and I'm probably one of the most skeptical motherfuckers you're ever going to hear in terms of that manifestation crap. So definitely check it out. You can find it at dualisticulunity.com in the store under workshops. We also have 4 other workshops. We're going to continue on Patreon in about 15 minutes for another 3 hours. Do join us if you can. And the reason I say that specifically is the more of us talk to Andrew right now, the more chance he has to reestablish new actions based on all of the new depth that he's experiencing. And that's really the only thing that's going to help him, is just getting in the shit more often and seeing how much he's taken in. Right. And that's always the process. So don't judge how you're doing. Don't judge what you're aware of. Just accept the fact that more awareness is ultimately more sensitivity, and that will change your life. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We will be back tomorrow morning, 11:30 Eastern time, for another episode of Dualistic Unity Raw, and we hope to see you there.